Welcome back. We are reading White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. Thank you for joining me again. We have finished chapter 1, and if you've missed out on chapter 1, you can find them on my YouTube channel. Also, if you subscribe to my Patreon, they're there as well. This book it's a pretty intense book, so we're working our way through it, but I think it's important because it's acknowledging and recognizing just how much of history is still here with us today. Starting on chapter 2, if you have been reading along, chapter 2 starts on page 39 of the hardback copy. The chapter is titled Derailing the Great Migration. Just a quick recap of the first chapter, which was titled Reconstructing Reconstruction. High-level overview. It was talking about after African Americans had been emancipated and quote-unquote freed from being enslaved, and the hardships that they faced as President Johnson looked for further ways to keep them essentially enslaved. Okay, chapter 2. It was 1918. The United States was in the midst of a global war to make the world safe for democracy. But in Georgia, it was anything but safe for Black people. In the southern part of the state near Valdosta, a white plantation owner, Hampton Smith, had become notorious for his brutal treatment of Black laborers on his farm. Because the standard employment management practices included beatings, theft of wages, and whippings, he had considerable difficulty hiring anyone to willingly work in his land. With fields to plow and a crop to harvest, he turned to an old trusty labor supply. Drawing on the peonage system set up after the Civil War, the planter routinely went to the local jail, paid the fine of a Black person, and then had the African American work on the plantation until the debt was paid. Think about almost like your bail bondsman is essentially what this man was doing. He was releasing Black Americans from jail only to have them work on his plantation to pay off the bond that was set. At least that was the way it was supposed to be. But Smith, although only 31 years old, was already a mean, hard man. He ruthlessly worked African Americans far past the point of any debt payoff and then refused to provide any compensation for the additional work. If challenged, he would pull out his whip. In May of 1918, he did that to the wrong Black man. After a dispute over work, Hampton Smith gave Sidney Johnson, an African American laborer whose $35 fine the plantation owner had paid, an unforgettable and unforgivable thrashing. Within a week after the beating, Johnson took out a rifle and put 2 bullets into the planter's chest. Smith died instantly. White retribution was swift, indiscriminate, and merciless. In a 5 days lynching orgy, at least 11 African Americans, 10 of whom had absolutely nothing to do with Smith's death, were hunted down and slaughtered, perhaps none more gruesomely than Mary Turner. I'm going to give you all a trigger warning now as I start reading. It's going to get a little descriptive, and that can be hard to listen to. So if you want to stop listening, this is your time to stop now. A lynch mob had already snatched her husband Hayes, strung him from a tree, and let his body rot. Dangling from that limb all weekend, 8 months pregnant with 2 small children, whom she had to send into hiding, she was enraged that he had been killed for no good reason. Feisty, strong-willed, and stubborn, Mary Turner threatened that if she knew the parties who were in the mob, she would have warrants sworn out against them. She would never get the chance. On Sunday, the lynchers came for her. They dragged Mary to a tree, stripped her, tied her ankles together, and strung her upside down. The men ran to their cars, brought back gasoline, and began to roast her alive. Then they saw her naked, 8-month pregnant stomach convulsing. That only sent the mob, made up of several of Hampton Smith's brothers, as well as a clerk in the post office, an auditor for Standard Oil, a furniture salesman, and several farmers into a deeper frenzy, as one man took out his knife and sliced away at her charred flesh until the baby, now ripped out of the womb, fell to the ground and gave 2 cries. Someone in the lynch party then stepped forward and smashed the child's head into the red Georgia dirt with the heel of his boot. In one form or another, this scene was repeated over and over again throughout the South, including the lack of consequences. No arrests, no trials, convictions, or prison sentences for murdering Black people, even in broad daylight. The economic, political, and legal vulnerability meant that no one, not even an 8-month-old fetus, was safe. Blacks in southern Georgia knew it. Within 2 months of Mary Turner's lynching, more than 500 had already moved away. They joined more than 1 million African Americans who were determined to leave the stultifying air of Jim Crow. And as one group fleeing Louisiana and heading North Carolina confided to W.E.B. Du Bois, run any risk to get where they could breathe freer. The risks they took were indeed great. It required an unfathomable amount of courage. It required as well a level of cunning and guile that many consistently underestimating African Americans didn't believe they had. The states and their supporters had erected a series of traps, sinkholes, and barriers, both legal and extra legal, to contain this clearly oppressed population. Yet, like those in Mary Turner's Georgia, they plotted their exodus. Southerner and novelist Richard Wright evoked perhaps most succinctly the desperation and the determination fueling it all. I've got to get away. I can't stay here. They would soon find out that the stories of the North as a promised land where drive, hard work, and ambition would be rewarded regardless of color had little to no relationship whatsoever to the actual conditions above the Mason-Dixon line. Robert S. Abbott, owner of the Chicago Defender, the premier Black newsletter, had experienced firsthand just how cruel the North could be, as his education and ambition translated into nothing more than years of closed doors and poverty. Still, the mirage of the promised land, coupled with the reality of conditions in the South, fueled the drive to leave. Can you imagine that desperation? You find out what's happening in the place that you thought was a place of relief and a place to feel freer, and you find out that it is perhaps not as overtly violent as where you're leaving, but your other choice is to stay in a place where they were hunting down people that look like you and killing people that look like you just for looking like you, to the point of ripping out an 8-month-old fetus. Those are your choices. Migration is the story of America. It is foundational. From pilgrims fleeing oppression in Europe to the millions who took advantage of the Homestead Act to go west, to the erection of the Statue of Liberty in New York's harbor, all the way up to the U.S. Congress tying most favored nation status to the human right of Soviet Jews to immigrate. The movement of people fleeing tyranny, violence, and withered opportunities is sacrosanct to Americans. In fact, freedom of movement is a treasured right in the nation's political lexicon. Yet, when more than 1.5 million African Americans left the land below the Mason-Dixon line, white Southern elites raged with cool, calculated efficiency. This was no lynch mob seeking vengeance. Rather, these were mayors, governors, legislators, business leaders, and police chiefs who bristled at the first step the nation's servant class ever took without asking. They bristled at African Americans leaving the place where they were being beaten, burned, and killed. They were upset that Black Americans and African Americans wanted to leave that. In the wood-paneled rooms of city halls, in the chambers of city councils, in the marbled state legislators, and in sheriff's offices, white government officials working hand in hand with plantation, lumber mill, and mine owners devised an array of obstacles and laws to stop African Americans as U.S. citizens from exercising the right to find better jobs, to search for good schools, indeed simply to escape the ever-present terror of lynch mobs. In short, the powerful, respectable elements of the white South rose up, in the words of then Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson, to stop the Great Migration and interfere with the natural right of workers to move from place to place at their own discretion. with this part of the chapter, I need people to understand. I want you all to understand what's actually happening here. You have the South where a man is deciding to pay the bond or the bail of African Americans to only remove them from jail to then beat them and work them beyond the debt that was owed. And when one man decided to act in self defense, that ignited white people to then want to murder African Americans at carte blanche simply because they were so upset at this one person who had committed heinous acts against Black Americans, this one person who did that, and the one person that went against him that caused an attack on all African Americans. And furthermore, beyond that attack of they did everything they could to keep African Americans there. That is a sick level of hatred. To not only act on hatred, meaning you're killing people and brutalizing them in the most heinous ways, but then to keep them there. We're talking about kidnapping. We're talking about holding these people hostage. And for what? For what? To become punching bags on top of being servants? That's a level of hatred. That is the divide that people talk about, essentially. That's what's happening. It's not when we say today, when Black people currently say today that we just want to be left alone, when you hear a Black person tell you that I just want to be left alone, when it comes to talking about race relations, Black people just want to be left alone. Chapter 2, this is a perfect reason why, because when we're not left alone, there is so much that's demanded upon us. And if we don't comply with that, then there's so much violence enacted upon us. The Great Migration had been spurred initially by Northern industries' desperate need for labor. World War I, which began in August 1914, had exponentially increased orders for manufactured goods, guns, battleships, steel, etc., while simultaneously reducing the traditional workplace of European immigrants responsible for producing those goods. The flow of immigrants dropped from more than 1.2 million in 1914 to just over 300,000 in 1915. Business leaders looking for an untapped source of labor soon realized that there was a vast pool of African Americans who previously had been shut out of the industrial workplace. Corporations like the Pennsylvania Railroad Company hired labor agents to go below the Mason-Dixon line and convince Black people to abandon Dixie and come north. For African Americans, this was a chance to escape, as Du Bois said, the hell of the South. The inferno was nearly unbearable. In the wake of the Civil War, government and judicial officials had decimated the right to vote, the economic provisions of 40 acres and a mule, the chance for good public schools, and equality before the law. Despite the 13th Amendment, African Americans had virtually no protection from a system that came painfully close to recreating the exploitation and brutality of chattel slavery. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, white Southerners had saturated the old Confederacy in Black blood. By 1920, in fact, there had been more than 1,000 lynchings per decade. And in the rebel South, almost 90% of those killed were African American. 5 states, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, accounted for more than half of all the lynchings in the nation. 5 states accounted for more than half the lynchings. One of the most macabre formats for the murderers was a spectacle lynching, which advertised the killing of a Black person and provided special promotional trains to bring the audience, including women and children, to the slaughter. These gruesome events were standard family entertainment. Severed body parts became souvenirs and decorations hung proudly in homes. And while African American women were not spared, they were particularly vulnerable to the systemic sexual violence as rape became part of a white man's rite of passage. All the while, the newly freed found themselves subject to barren education deserts and barely, if at all, remunerated labor. Ambition was forbidden. Ambition was forbidden. How often have you heard that Black people are lazy? How often have you heard that Black people just aren't trying? How often have you heard that Black people just act like the victims? African Americans knew all too well that the Dixie limit beyond which no Black could advance. Whenever the colored man prospered too fast in this country, complained Ned Cobb, a Black farmer and former sharecropper, they worked every figure to cut you down, cut your britches off you. He understood that his success, indeed, the fact that he had acquired some land and managed to not be in debt to local whites, made him a threat. They looked hard, didn't stop looking. This is him speaking. They didn't like to see a nigger with too much. They didn't like it one bit, and it caused him to throw a slang word about a nigger having all of this, that, and the other. Whites, Cobb explained, just hated to see niggers living like people. Similarly, an Alpharetta, Georgia farmer who had just wanted to be free, and vote free, explained that the South was no place for an honest, hardworking, ambitious man. Better not accumulate much, he warned, because no matter how hard and honest you work for it, as they, well, you can't enjoy it. In that stammer lay the bone chilling truth that signs of prosperity could attract night riders and the bloodletting, torture, and land seizure that inevitably followed. Equally vicious was the practice of whitecapping, which, since the horrors of Bosnia and Srebrenica were now recognized as ethnic cleansing, in several Georgia and Mississippi countries where plantations did not dominate the economy, local whites maimed, murdered, and terrorized African Americans, and as a persecuted, fled, seized all the land until one could ride for miles and not see a Black face. Again, we're going to pause on chapter 2 for right now. It comes down again to just speaking to the hatred, and there's no other way that you can describe this. This is pure hatred. This is pure hatred to do everything that you can to force a group of people to stay where they're being brutalized. And then while they're there, not allow them to have anything of their own, because if they do, now you're going to kill them. To invite families to watch these murders, to take home souvenirs, body parts they called souvenirs. That's nothing more than hate. There's no other way to describe what would cause that to be something that felt right to do. There's no other way to describe that. Now, when you think about today, because we've been talking about how history is repeating itself or it's a continuation of itself, when you think about today, do we have actual lynching parties? No. But do you see people so excited to share videos of Black violence or violence against Black bodies? Do you see? I remember when Tyree Nichols was murdered, and within hours of the body cam footage coming out, people had it on videos, they had it on live streaming. There is no way, there's just no way that you can hear this and know the actual history of Black Americans and African Americans in this country. There's no way that you can hear this and think that we are not working from a place of hate, that we are not working from a place of hate coming from white Americans, from European Americans towards Black people. That is the origin of the country. That is a continuation of this country. Because if we talk about now how difficult it is, we've heard it. Go back to Africa. We can't. And we're in Africa, we don't know our roots. We don't know what country we came from. The process to leave this country is exhausting and not cost efficient and not always accessible to everybody. So just like in the 1900s, where white people did everything to keep Black people close but still cause harm, that's what's happening in this country today. Make it so difficult for us to leave, but then also make it so difficult for us to prosper here. That's some things to think about. I have been offering a journal prompt too for my Patreon members, and I feel like I want to bring that here as well. If you are inclined to journal about what you're reading or what you're hearing, my journal prompt for you is going to be something pretty personal. I want you to think about what it means when you hear a Black person tell you that they just want to be left alone. After hearing this history, I want you to journal about and think about what it means to be told no by a Black person when you want access to them. I want you to think about what it means or what it feels like to you and what it means when a Black person says we want a safe space for Black people. Again, knowing this history. Thank you again for reading along with me. Again, we're in chapter 2. If you've been reading along, we're stopping on page 44 after the first paragraph. And I will see you all next week with the continuation of chapter 2. Y'all make sure to stay hydrated with this. We'll see you soon.